All right. Okay. Well, thank you for bearing with me. I swear I have presented using slides before, although not always from that experience. I'm super excited to be here with you all today, and folks online too. Thank you so much for coming and for inviting me to be here tonight. My name is Sam, and as was mentioned earlier, thanks so much for the kind intro. I'm a senior policy advisor at the Government of Canada as part of the Canadian Digital Service. And what I'm here to talk to you about tonight is a research report that I worked on called, that explored the research question, how can civic tech, so groups like Civic Tech Toronto here tonight, help improve government service delivery? So the way that this idea came about was actually, if we cast our minds back to the distant time of 2020, 2021, the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, I was at CVS and so much was happening. Things were changing all the time. Governments were really scrambling to figure out how to support people through this unprecedented pandemic. And one of the things that the Canadian Digital Service started working on was the COVID Alert app. Have folks heard, anyone heard about that? It was the, okay, well, a few hands. So basically this was the National Exposure Notification app that came out to help folks across Canada figure out if they might have been exposed to COVID-19 and what to do if that happened. So this was built on a totally new technology at the time, a framework that Google and Apple came out with. No one really knew exactly how to implement it. Everyone within governments and externally were trying to figure this out as we went. And so within the government, we ended up collaborating with lots of folks who were not necessarily government employees, but we started talking to more folks in the private sector, working with civic tech volunteers and so on. And what we realized within my team as we were starting to work on this project was that this was pretty new for many people across government. So many people, public servants, hadn't really heard about civic tech or worked with volunteers in this kind of way before. And we really sort of wished we had something to point them to that was sort of a quick primer, not just of civic tech, because that exists and there's lots of great resources that Civic Tech Toronto even has, but also that gives examples of, how has civic tech groups worked with governments in the past? How do you know if something is a good fit for a partnership between a government and a civic tech organization? But that resource didn't really exist. And we ended up basically saying, well, maybe we should do something about it and try and fill that gap. So that's kind of how this whole project started. And the way that we went about doing that was essentially I talked to a bunch of people. So I talked to a bunch of people, many of whom are in this room on this call, 27 people in total, and then more folks who I just sort of bounced ideas off of, and got a lot of insight about how people across Canada in civic tech communities have been working with governments, and then also how government staff has worked with civic tech in the past. So I ended up talking to people who were civic tech contributors like yourselves, people who worked within different governments across Canada who had collaborated. Thank you. All right. Okay. I'm not going to touch, none of us are going to touch anything except just the forward thing on my slides. It's all, we're not going to mess with anything else. Cool. Thank you all for your patience and all of the tech support and stuff.
Go ahead, Sam.
All right. What was I doing? I wrote this thing. So yeah, so this is the report. Basically, it looked at the answers that we got to this question of how might civic tech help improve government service delivery. And the lens that we decided to look at it through was case studies, because this was one of the big gaps that I found when I was trying to help explain what civic tech is to some of our colleagues within the public service. Like, we wanted some real examples. There were a few things out there, but we wanted more. And so from talking to folks about this topic across Canada, we came up with these 5 case studies, which will be familiar to some folks in the room. Is anyone from, is Bike Space here? Yeah, yay, Bike Space, amazing. So Bike Space, we had Vaccine Hunters Canada in the room, I believe as well, yes. So lots of folks who contributed to this report across the country, sharing stories of these collaborations between government and civic tech groups across the country to help really make sense of what the potential for these partnerships are. Now, So what? All right, I just told you I wrote a report for my government colleagues. Why am I here talking to you about it? Well, that reason is that I think there's actually a lot of valuable insights in this research for civic tech groups as well. So even though the report itself is addressed more to other public servants, there's lots of little nuggets of insight for folks like yourselves who might be interested in, at some point in your civic tech projects, connecting with folks in government and potentially starting up some kind of partnership there. I also know that a lot of the civic tech projects bubble up because we see issues with the way that things are happening in public services and aim to address them. And so there might be opportunities there to collaborate with the government departments that are responsible for some of those things. So what I've done today is taken out some of the findings that you won't see this exactly in the report, but I've tried to pull out some key takeaways specifically for folks like yourselves in the room and on the call today who are working on civic tech initiatives and might be interested in collaborating with government. So what are they? The three things that I wanted to share with you today are just little tidbits. There's lots more in there, but these were kind of three big things that came up throughout most of my conversations that I think could be really helpful for contributors working on civic tech projects who want to collaborate with governments. So I'm going to go through each of these briefly and then we can chat. So first, seek out civic tech champions inside government. That might seem a bit obvious, I think, especially to folks who have already had these collaborations, but I thought it was important to call out just how important in all of the conversations and all of these case studies that I looked at, having a champion or two within a government department who was really invested in supporting the civic tech project, collaborating with civic tech, who, as this quote from one of my interviewees said, who's willing to go to the weekly Hacknight, go to the phone calls, make that effort to build those relationships. That was really vital to all of the case studies that we talked about in the report. And it goes both ways, of course, having folks on the civic tech side as well. But that really seemed to be a key part of how a lot of these projects both started and were able to be successful. So I know that Bike Space, for example, started up when you had a couple of folks from the city of Toronto coming with a problem. There's not enough bike parking. Is this something that civic tech can help with? And that's, from that we have the amazing project that is Bike Space. Another example that came up through within these case studies is Riverwatch Mobile, which was a civic tech project out of Civic Tech Fredericton. Again, it came out of something that a public servant from the provincial government pitched at actually Civic Tech's very first Hacknight. The provincial public servant said, we've got all of this data, all this open source data on flood forecasting, but people can't access it on mobile devices. And when people are being impacted by floods, they're having to leave their homes or preparing to do so, they need to access this data on their phones. So is that something you can help with? And Civic Tech Fredericton said yes. They built Riverwatch Mobile, and then they ran it for 2 years in close collaboration with the provincial government, to the point that the province actually ended up taking it over, and now it's run by the provincial government there. So that having those champions within the government really was integral to every project, but I thought those were two very good examples of just sort of how that can spark a really fruitful partnership. Now you might be thinking, okay, well, Sam, where are our public servants pitching these ideas that we can come and help with? So that it doesn't always happen that way. So I also wanted to suggest that, if you don't have someone from a government body coming and saying like, hey, I need help with this thing, you can also go out and find those folks too. And so here's just a couple ideas. Like, I think conferences are a great way to do that. And I don't necessarily mean going to conferences. I mean, you can go to conferences, that's great. You can also creep the speaker list and look at like, who is speaking, who's talking about the types of things that I'm interested in or that my project is focusing on, and reach out to folks that way. So obviously going to conferences, Forward 50 is a big one that I know a lot of my colleagues at the federal government go to. GC Data Conference, that's actually run by the federal government. This year's just happened, but it's open to the public as well. So like, look for those spaces where you might be able to find those champions and just reach out to them. The worst that can happen is someone doesn't get back to you, but a lot of the time public servants, especially in these spaces that are kind of related to digital, are really keen to talk to folks and learn about projects that are happening. So related to that, the second piece that I wanted to talk about, the second takeaway, is to invite folks from the civic tech community to be curious about government processes, requirements, and priorities, and the rationale for them. Because a lot of what government does and how government does it doesn't make sense to people outside. It doesn't always make sense to people inside. I will tell you that. But you know what? That's just the reality of so many places where all of us work, right? Like we're all figuring things out and figuring out how to work within the system to achieve the things that we're aiming to achieve. Having that partnership within government that partner within government can really help you navigate those areas as well. And if you're looking to build or design a civic tech project that you think might be a good candidate to collaborate with government, it's always a good idea to do a little poking around or to look at, what are some of the requirements that government programs in this area need to meet in order to be successful, in order to meet, the obligations of the government overall. So just some examples from the federal level, which is where I work. When federal programs are created, anything the federal government does, we really need to focus on being able to serve every single person that that program is intended to serve. And so we have certain laws, many laws that we're required to follow that are intended to make that happen. So for example, we have the Accessible Canada Act, the Privacy Act, the Official Languages Act, and even just using the last as an example, if you're working on something that you're like, this would be really cool maybe to collaborate with the federal government on, one thing to be aware of is that we need everything to be fully bilingual so that people are able to access services in their official language of choice. So that's a good thing to have in mind if you're working on something that you might want to, have some kind of partnership with at the federal level. That's going to be something that comes up pretty early. So if you can think about that early on, or if you have that champion inside to help you figure out how to navigate it, that can be really helpful in laying a good foundation for a potential partnership. And then the third takeaway I wanted to mention is that there are lots of ways that public servants and government departments can collaborate with civic tech that doesn't necessarily involve money changing hands. Money changing hands is great, and that can be really important too. But I think when we're creative on both sides, from both sectors about what that kind of partnership can look like, we can find a lot of really interesting ways to collaborate that might not be as complicated, frankly, as sometimes providing funding is. So one example from the case studies that I wanted to bring up here is actually from Vaccine Hunters Canada. When during that time at the beginning of the pandemic, as the vaccines were starting to come out, I'm sure folks remember it was chaos, trying to find information about where appointments were, how to book them, and so on. It was very difficult to find that info. So Vaccines Hunters Canada and Vaccine Ontario, both of which are in the case studies in this report, started up civic tech projects to try and make it easier for Canadians to find that information and book appointments. The Vaccine Ontario folks said in a quote that's in the report that one of the hardest things, the thing that took up the most time, wasn't building the software. It was scraping and cleaning the data. So every day they were having to manually go to all these sites, gather the data, put it in a format that all worked, that worked with what they built. And that was a real challenge, took up most of the volunteer time. And I'm sure it was similar for Vaccine Hunters as well. Now, what I thought was really interesting was that Vaccine Hunters was able to partner with the city of Toronto to get information, that data directly from the city about next day appointments. And so that, I don't know, Andrew, you can talk more about it later, but I imagine that was pretty unlocking, right? Like even more in some instances than money, getting that data, not having to spend the time scraping and cleaning it. I mean, you probably still had to clean it, but having that direct source was something that could only really be offered by the city. And that was a real boon to a civic tech project like Vaccine Hunters. And so that's just one example from the report that shows, it's not always necessarily money, like sometimes it's other kinds of contributions that can really be unlocking. And so we can be kind of creative about thinking around what these collaborations can look like. And so finally, these are just a few more examples of the kinds of ways that the case studies in the report talk about how these partnerships between governments and civic tech, ways that the government has supported. So like offering space for Hacknights like tonight, promoting those civic tech projects, offering access to government experts. That was key to a lot of the case studies that we looked at. And also just thinking about those type of collaborations leading to future potential partnerships as well. So it kind of comes full circle as a way to develop those relationships and find your champions within government. So I'm going to end there. there's the full report. Unfortunately, I don't have any really pretty short links, so I'll just send out the deck after. You can click on that. But yeah, thank you so much again for having me tonight. I'm really looking forward to chatting a bit more. And yeah, I think we're going to do questions and stuff now, and then I'm going to stick around here later. Thank you.